SAFSTOR Matters!
Hi, I'm Marty Cohn, Senior Communications Specialist at Entergy Vermont Yankee, and welcome to Episode 4 of SAFSTOR Matters, a program devoted to the activities of Vermont Yankee during the decommissioning process. To review, in August of 2013, Entergy decided that it was going to be closing Vermont Yankee at the end of 2014, which we did on December 29th. By mid-January, all of the fuel was removed from the reactor and placed inside the spent fuel pool. We also informed the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that we had permanently ceased operations. A lot of work has been done to transition the plant and the organization to support long-term storage in Vernon. And today, we are going to be discussing the economic impact of that decision, along with Jennifer Stromsten, Program Director, Institute for Nuclear Host Communities. Jen, welcome to Episode 4.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, so before we begin, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and this Institute for Nuclear Host Communities?
Sure. I live in Greenfield with my family, and we moved up to this area about a dozen years ago. And I sort of fell into this work while I was doing a planning degree, master's degree in regional planning at UMass. My work has been in community development and economic development, and I came into this because of Dr. John Mullen. Basically, he wrote 20 years ago, almost, still one of the only studies on the socioeconomic impacts of a closure, and that was about Yankee Row. I was commissioned by Yankee Atomic, and it was just looking at the various ways in which the loss of jobs, the loss of tax revenue sort of impacted Row specifically, although since then we've been looking more kind of regional, because we kind of realized that some of the subtler impacts over time are kind of more spread out.
So the Institute has been studying this for a while. It's not just because of Vermont Yankee.
Well, the Institute was kind of stimulated by the Vermont Yankee situation. I mean, the reality is that Dr. Mullen's been looking at this for a long time, but what happened is somewhere along the way, a few years ago, as you know, in this area, there were some folks who realized that they needed to look at what was going to happen to the region when VY closed. And they did that before the closure had been announced. There were some prescient people in this community who said, we kind of need to take a closer look at when we lose these jobs, we lose the spending, not just the spending of the workers, but of the company, for example. We need to look at this because we're going to have to plan for this because we can't absorb more hits without being a little more proactive. And so there was actually a terrific study done by folks here in the region, and it was pretty smart because pretty shortly after the closure was announced, and as you know, not everyone expected that. That wasn't a clear outcome because the plant had been relicensed. Mm-hmm. And so what we found here is that there were people who were readier than most communities are when closure was announced. Mm-hmm. And so because of that, a number of things have been able to happen here ahead of time that in past closures has not happened. For a variety of reasons.
So let me ask you though, is there a difference in the closing of a nuclear facility versus a large employer leaving? Is there a difference in those impacts?
We think that there are some really important similarities. I mean, it's a hit if it's 500 auto workers losing their jobs or 500 nuclear workers. And so some of that is just, nope, it just hurts either way. Some of it is context dependent. Some of it is if you lose 500 jobs in a metropolitan area where you have a couple million jobs, it doesn't matter as much. But nuclear power plants tend to be in out of the way places with pretty vulnerable economies, so that's one of them. So that's a special thing about nuclear. There are some other special things about nuclear. I mean, you have an incredibly well-trained and highly specialized workforce, and they are at least right now, in high demand. You have an aging workforce nationally. There's a lot of demand for those folks. So as we know from the last round of downsizing at the plant, a lot of those folks moved away. So you not only lose workers, you lose jobs. Or you not only lose jobs, you lose workers.
Right.
And that's really kind of special because you won't necessarily see in your unemployment numbers something that looks scary. But it is very scary. And we think that's for two reasons. I mean, not only do you not have someone who you could redeploy to another kind of a job, you are also losing what we talk about as like social and intellectual capital. You're losing a lot of households that had great earnings, that had often in areas like this, you live here, I live here, there aren't enough households where you have someone making enough money to maybe have a stay-at-home parent, or where they're making enough money to be good, strong donors, volunteers. They have steady work, and they are coaching teams on the weekend. That kind of social capital, we kind of run on that. I mean, my kids belong to sports teams that without that kind of volunteerism, those teams won't run. Huh. We can't afford to pay enough. We can't really hire coaches to replace those. And so as we lose these families, we really see a loss of some really tangible things. Some people who are making as much as 1.5 times the median wage in the area, which is pretty substantial. And we're also losing just people power. That's pretty tough to replace, but also tough to quantify.
So when you're looking at the impact, and so the Institute for Nuclear Host Communities doesn't just look at the economic impact, but it's also the socioeconomic impact. So so you're also looking at the families, the loss of the families. Do you look about philanthropy? Is that something that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's not just what the plant gives; it's what the workers give. It's volunteer time. It's and we're also interested in some of the nuances of that. In a community like this where there is some pretty significant poverty and need, it's important to look at what kinds of programs are being supported that are essential to the well-being of some of the communities most vulnerable. And I think early on, the VY Impact Study, I think, actually identified some of the social organizations locally that would be really hard hit. I mean, it's one thing to say, wow, a certain, a farmland trust fund, or they're going to take a hit, and that's a bummer. But it doesn't have the same immediate human toll as a social services program that may be providing meals for families taking that kind of a hit in the near term. So those are the kinds of differences that we think are also important.
So when you were studying the impact here in Vermont, did you do any interviews of who did you talk to?
Well, we didn't do the study, the VY Impact Study. So, and there's not really a need to repeat it because it was done really well.
Okay.
And so what we have been doing is sort of following up on the Roe study to take a longer look. And so we've done some pretty fun, frankly, interviews with folks who've been in the region for decades, who've served on decommissioning committees, or folks who are in Reedsboro, which was really a real rural service center through the time that Roe was operating, and trying to just look at what are some of the long-term changes over time. One of them, I was just talking to someone yesterday about this story that we think is really interesting. The rise of rural infrastructure coincides with these nuclear power plants being built and operating here. And as they go away, it's not necessarily causal, but you see a lot of weakening of things like health infrastructure. We saw the North Adams Hospital closure, which is kind of terrifying. And they're all bound up together. That's not caused by these things, but they're all sort of coincident. And so in one of the conversations I was having with a gentleman about Roe, when it was being built, he was talking about the federal government investing in developing health practices in West County. Sort of basically, so you'd have family practices for this kind of important, robust workforce that had to serve this nuclear power plant. And I forgot about that entirely. That conversation was several months ago, except I was looking at the back of the Greenfield Recorder the other day in the little mini ads, and there was a little notice that said West County physicians will be closing their doors. And I thought, that's sort of the end of the story.
Right.
And that tells you something about not just the nuclear power plant and the economic impacts, but it's like there's a whole piece of the health infrastructure of this community, this region, that was there and now it's gone, and they're tied in together. So we think that's important. I mean, for our quality of life, for those of us who live here, everyone who lives up in that area doesn't have a family practice there anymore.
So is there at the end of the day, do you, in these discussions, is there things that we could have been doing? I mean, we gave,
Yeah.
in terms of the closure, Entergy gave the community 18 months. Said,
Yep.
all right, we're going to be closing in 18 months, but we're going to be here, for a period of time after. Is there anything that a community could have done or should have been doing?
It's fun. We think about this a lot in terms of best practices because we have the luxury of, thinking about it in theory and saying, well, if we could pick and choose from here and there, so we can look at base realignment and closure and take off the table the ones that didn't go well and just look at the really good ones. Say that was a really good redevelopment authority that was established well in advance. So there was somewhere to park some money and develop some capacity and do some planning to replace jobs and develop new economic activity. Is that something that is going to happen from Entergy or from another private operator? That's not really likely, and that's more of a government function. What we're finding as we look at this, and this is not to get too sort of abstract about it, but there's a change that has happened over time where public utilities had kind of responsible for the regional economy, and they kind of don't, at least in this region anymore. And no one else really does in the same way. It used to be that if the utility in the region wanted more customers, they needed to help businesses grow. And we find that there's kind of a gap in general. And we can go to specific utilities. I mean, I know that Fairpoint has been very supportive of certain economic development planning in this area, so there are huge exceptions. But as a general kind of holding that piece as something that's part of our mission, our corporate mission, I mean corporate in the most general sense,
Right.
there isn't really that kind of a thing anymore. And so that's why we think this, and that's not how it works for base closures, it's not how it works for big military sites being transitioned. So all that to say, the short answer is, I don't know that anyone here could have done anything different, but there are better ways to go about this if you look at how some sort of similarly complex situations are handled with military bases and
So the lessons learned here might help the next community.
we think so, and there are some best practices here. I mean, we think everybody needs to have this information. You need to know how many people work there and how do those jobs function in your economy. Are they really outsized? Are they big players in your economy? And what kind of spending is there? We've looked at Vermont as much as we've looked at all of the plants in the country. We just didn't do the specific sort of detailed study here. And what we see is there's real variation that is important to understand. So there's a lot of local spending here. And, EVY, you had a local spending policy. That's not true for every plant. And also there are a lot of places where there just aren't enough places to spend money. If we wanted our waste management and our Xerox services locally, we couldn't get them anyway because we're in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
That's a huge difference. The difference between, that can be hundreds of millions of dollars a year difference in your economy in terms of how that kind of money plays through if there are no other local businesses to be spending your money in. So we know that that's important. When we are looking at Pilgrim, we just did a study for them, for Plymouth, and for their regional planning agency, and they have a lot of local vendors. It's Entergy, local spending practices, and also a lot of terrific contractors and companies in the region, which is awesome. That also means you will feel hits at multiple levels reverberating throughout the regional economy when that plant is done in, hopefully a couple of decades, given, I think you have 18 years left on that license. So that's what we want people to pay attention to, those sort of nuances, that one plant may look like another on paper. They may be the same design. Context is everything when it comes to the economics.
Sure.
So.
Well, let's take a short break for this word from Next Era Energy about the economic impact at Seabrook Nuclear.
For more than a decade, NextEra Energy has operated Seabrook Station, generating clean, reliable electricity for customers. And according to a new study, it also generates a big positive impact on the local economy of Seabrook, New Hampshire. According to the Nuclear Energy Institute, Seabrook Station is making a $535 million impact on the local economy and a nearly $1.5 billion economic impact nationally every year.
My reaction was that the statistics were staggering.
It's not only jobs, but I think that the jobs that are brought lead to the development of other businesses and other jobs.
Seabrook employs 650 full-time people, hires additional help for outages and refueling, creating an even bigger economic impact. The plant's activity, including the money it spends for the services and equipment it needs to power New Hampshire, generates about $140 million in income and approximately 1,800 local jobs. State Representative Cohn has seen business flourish.
The employees who lives in this town, they shop in my business and they are frequent customer of mine. It is a big help.
Seabrook employees like Bonnie Bryant say having stable, good-paying jobs allows them to invest in their community. Construction crews are building a new shopping center near the plant's entrance, and new homes continue to go up.
I take great pride in the fact that we can safely provide power to our customers. But in addition to that, I take pride in the way that we're able to support the local economy, in many ways support goods and services.
What I hope that people take away from it is a validation that we provide a very, very valuable resource, and the secondary effects of what we do are far beyond just generating electricity in terms of public outreach, in terms of the environment, and in terms of just providing a commodity like electricity that enriches people's lives.
Welcome back. In this episode of SAFSTOR Matters, we're discussing the economic impact of Vermont Yankee closing. Our guest is Jennifer Stromsten, who is the Program Director for the Institute for Nuclear Host Communities. So Jen, we just saw about the impact at Seabrook in New Hampshire. What can you tell us about here in Vermont? I mean, where do you see it really breaking down? What do we need to do?
Well, I think that right now everyone's doing everything they can with what they have. And because, for instance, of some of the funds that were negotiated through the MOU, not only is that money being used to stimulate economic activity, it actually, the way that works, it's being leveraged to bring in other investment, which is really important. And I think that what you're going to, I can't emphasize how much the local economic development folks, the CDC, the regional planners, are scrambling to make everything they can with the resources that have been made available to them. What we like to see is that this is kind of providing a motivation for communities to plan. You know, we're not going out there saying, hey, someone's going to give you a bunch of money if you plan a little bit. But we think that if you start to look at what the impacts will be of having this thing and of losing this thing, and start to talk about it in real numbers, it gets you a step closer to saying, well, we're going to need some resources to go forward and replace that economic activity, and that makes it more likely that you can secure some of those funds. And you know, it depends on who you're talking to. You're talking about public utilities and merchant plants, but the reality is you can't even begin that conversation without information. And what happens, I think, is that when you give people a little bit of hope that it's worth doing the planning. That's very helpful. So the Vermont story is actually kind of terrific. That, you know, really, I mean, they have some pretty substantial resources, at least a lot more substantial than any other communities had before in the U.S. to plan with. And that's really led to some terrific and detailed planning and some very specific initiatives. I mean, the upcoming year is going to be filled with great announcements about specific things going on in this community, building off of that money and efforts related to it.
So the Vermont story, you mentioned before, you went to Plymouth and you talked about the economic impact to the community at Pilgrim, another Entergy plant. Are you finding, as you're telling this story, that this is something that can be told throughout the country? I mean,
yeah, I think it's. I think what we're partly trying to do is to say this is something we can talk about rationally, reasonably, and especially when we have a little information on the table. It sort of, first of all, brings people start to get interested because the numbers are kind of powerful or they're compelling, and it also it just leads to a pretty reasonable discussion. I mean, we held our organization through a conference a little over a year ago, and we got 50-ish people in the room from all different federal, state, regional folks, activists, planners, and legislators. What we found is that no one really disagrees on this topic. You know,
right.
Well, it is, we care about our community's economic health, and if we see that communities years down the road who had a closed plant have not really rebounded economically and maybe could have done better if there had been more information, more resources, and the ability to take some more action. So we'd like to have that outcome. We'd like to change those kinds of outcomes, and it's not easy. I mean, this is hard work. These are this is the kind of work that has to go on anyway. I mean, the baseline economy of this region has been struggling for a long time. There's no reason not to do this work. It helps a lot to have some resources and some focus.
Right.
And so in some ways, what was funny at the end of that conference day, where was that the word opportunity started being thrown around at the end of the day. Sort of like, this is an opportunity to, for instance, get people together who haven't had anything to agree on for a long time.
Right.
This is an opportunity to get people focused on economic development and health in a way that we haven't been able to really get people excited about. And so that was unexpected to us. We weren't expecting such a positive upswing at the end of the day, but that is what kind of makes this work fun. Where it gets a little tricky is there isn't a lot of great baseline information. I mean, what we are developing is just some of that research. We have a sense, we know that nuclear employs sort of more people per megawatt than most forms of energy, at a higher rate of pay than most forms of energy. Well, that's not common knowledge. That's not really an understood thing.
Right.
This isn't, you don't take a nuclear power plant and replace it with a gas plant and see all of the impacts replaced.
Right.
It just isn't like that.
Right.
It doesn't mean that you don't need to replace that energy, but those are two kind of separate discussions.
Right.
And so we think that there's a lot of just basic knowledge that needs to be built up. And then there's sort of the site details that are very important. I mean, when you talk about outages at Seabrook, outages in the context of a really tourism-driven economy are really important because they actually help pad out a short seasonal economy.
Right.
That's not as important here in southern Vermont. There is some seasonal tourism economy, but it's not as heavy as Plymouth. Or probably the Seabrook area. And so for them, understanding the role of those outages in, sort of adding to rooms and meals tax, and hospitality spending, that's sort of a nuance that we would want to emphasize more than, for instance, in this kind of context.
Well, I'll tell you that in looking at the history of Entergy Vermont Yankee, we probably could have done a better job in letting the community know all the things that we were doing. I mean, we were doing them. Part of our corporate philosophy was, we're part of the community, we want to be part of and do these things, but we didn't stop and go, hey, look at what we're doing. I can tell you that since we closed, something that's happening at other sites and in other nuclear power plants is that people are now talking about that impact, and I think that's a good discussion. What's also exciting, but and I hate you use the word economics and fun. I never thought those two words would come together. But what you're able to do is come together, whether you're pro-nuclear, anti-nuclear, it doesn't matter because you're pro-community.
Exactly.
Now, what are the plans? Where are you going to take the institute with the study?
Right. We have we've been paying a lot of attention, as you know, because we see each other at the decommissioning committee meetings. We've been paying a lot of attention to the processes, trying to figure out where we can find some important learnings to help communities in the future structure closure processes in terms of the community engagement side. Part of that is because we know communities have limited resources in terms of planning, and if you are caught unprepared, there's not much left over for socioeconomic stuff. So even though we don't focus on safety and environmental particularly, we also know that those are the same people. The same people who need to look at the economic stuff in small places tend to be the folks who have to deal with the EPZ and all of the meeting the NRC on the site. And so what we think is that communities better prepared will have a little more kind of bandwidth left over to focus on the social and economic side. So we're kind of working on figuring out that work and applying it on some specific sites and sort of making some recommendations. But what we have also heard over and over again from communities is that they want to talk to each other. They want to talk to past closure communities, and they want to talk to, and when I say communities, I mean local, regional, county, state officials responsible for specific sites. They want to talk to peers who also are in operating plant communities. And so we've been looking for an opportunity to bring together host communities, but also to kind of do some learning and some exploring of ideas. Like, what is this like and what is this not like? Are these like nuclear, are these like coal plant closures? How are they not similar? Those are important questions because they affect how funding comes from government and how kind of regulatory changes might help bring nuclear actually in line with some of the capacity that has been dedicated to coal site closures. So we have a conference happening this fall. It's not our conference, it's actually a session at the 31st Annual Association of Environmental Health and Sciences Conference at UMass Amherst. And they have welcomed us in. We proposed an idea of an afternoon session on nuclear closures, and this group of environmental professionals were much more excited about this idea than we expected them to be.
Great.
And it's interesting. These are folks who've worked on military-based closures. They've worked on brownfields for decades. I mean, they see how this can be improved and expanded. So we're excited. It's late October, and aehsfoundation.org is the website. The preliminary program is up.
Okay.
We're really excited.
Well, we'll have a link to that on our website. Thank you, Jen, for being on the show. Special thanks to Dennis Cordell for writing the original music for this show that you'll probably be humming the rest of the day. Thanks also to Sarah Burnap for all her behind-the-scenes magic, and the folks here at BCTV. For all of us at Vermont Yankee, I'm Marty Cohn. Thanks for watching.